Hello and welcome. Wherever you are tonight, let your breathing slow down, one gentle breath at a time. The day is finished now. You do not need to solve anything else. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your thoughts become lighter. My name is Jordan, and tonight I'll walk with you through the history and into sleep. Tonight we travel back to feudal Japan, to misty mountains, quiet bamboo forests, ancient wooden estates, and the gentle rhythm of rain falling on curved clay roofs. We will spend some time walking through the silent world of the samurai, not hurrying, not forcing the story, just listening, one calm moment at a time. If sleep comes early, let it come. You are safe here. You only need to rest and listen. So close your eyes, settle into the dark, and when you are ready, we begin. To understand the samurai, you must first understand the world that created him. Feudal Japan was not a single, unified nation. It was a vast, fractured mosaic of territories, each one ruled by a powerful lord called a daimyo. These lords controlled great stretches of farmland, mountain passes, and coastal ports. They built towering castles of stone and dark timber, and they commanded private armies of warriors sworn to die in their service. Above the daimyo sat the shogun, the supreme military ruler of all Japan. In theory, the emperor still existed. He lived in the ancient capital of Kyoto, performing sacred rituals and observing the turning of the seasons, but he held no real power. The shogun ruled through force, through alliances, and through an intricate web of loyalty and obligation. This system was called the Bakuhan Taisei, a rigid hierarchy where every person, from the highest warlord to the lowest farmer, knew their place. At the heart of this system stood the samurai. The word itself comes from the verb saburao, which means to serve. A samurai was not, at his core, a free warrior roaming the land in search of glory. He was a servant, bound by an unbreakable oath to his lord. His life, his sword, his family, and his death all belonged to the daimyo he served. This bond of loyalty, called chugi, was the foundation upon which the entire feudal world was built. Without it, the system would collapse. And so, loyalty was not merely valued, it was absolute. But the world of the samurai was not always the same. For centuries, during the era known as the Sengoku, the age of warring states, Japan was consumed by near-constant civil war. Rival daimyo fought for territory, for power, and for survival. During this time, a samurai's worth was measured on the battlefield. He trained relentlessly, he marched through rain and mud, and he fought in brutal, chaotic engagements where the line between life and death was impossibly thin. The Sengoku was a time of fire and uncertainty, but it also a time when a talented warrior, regardless of his birth, could rise through the ranks. Men of humble origins became generals, generals became lords, and lords toppled shoguns. Then, in the year 1600, everything changed. A powerful warlord named Tokugawa Ieyasu won a decisive victory at the Battle of Sekigahara, and he unified the country under a single, iron rule. The Tokugawa shogunate would last for over 250 years, a period known as the Edo era. And for the samurai, this new peace was a profound transformation. The wars stopped, the battlefield fell silent, and the warrior class found itself in a world that no longer needed warriors. The Edo samurai did not charge across muddy fields. He sat at a desk. He managed rice accounts for his lord. He attended ceremonies, copied documents, and navigated the subtle, exhausting politics of the court. His swords, once tools of survival, became symbols of status, polished, maintained with reverence but rarely drawn. It was during this long, quiet peace that many of the traditions we now associate with the samurai truly flowered. The tea ceremony, the rock garden, the careful study of poetry and calligraphy. These were not distractions from a warrior's life. They were the new substance of it. And so the samurai became something more complex than a simple soldier. He became a scholar, a bureaucrat, a philosopher, and a keeper of tradition. All while carrying at his side the constant reminder of a fiercer, older world. To be born into a samurai family was to be born into a life of preordained paths. From the first breath, a male child was recognized as more than just a son. He was a future link in a chain of honor that stretched back through centuries of ancestors. In his earliest years, the world of the young boy was soft and filled with the gentle presence of the women of the estate. He spent his days in the inner quarters, surrounded by the rustle of silk kimonos and the soothing songs of his mother and nurses. But even then, the shadow of his future was present. His toys were small wooden swords and miniature bows, gifts that hinted at the steel he would one day wield. As he reached his 5th or 7th year, the soft world of the inner chambers began to fade. The transition was silent but absolute. He was moved to the outer quarters, into the world of men, where the air was cooler and the discipline was unyielding. His childhood was not meant to be a time of carefree play. It was a deliberate, steady preparation for the weight of the world he was destined to protect. His education began in the quiet, dim rooms of the estate, where the only sound was the wind through the bamboo and the occasional drip of rain from the eaves. He sat for hours on the tatami mats, his small legs tucked beneath him, learning the difficult art of stillness. A samurai's greatest enemy was not a rival swordsman, but his own restless mind. Before he could learn to fight, he had to learn to sit. He was taught to read the complex characters of his language, studying the ancient classics of philosophy that had traveled from China centuries before. He labored over the Analects of Confucius, memorizing verses about duty, righteousness, and the correct order of the universe. Through these texts, he He learned that a warrior without a cultivated mind was merely a common soldier. He learned that his life belonged to his lord, his family, and his honor, in that exact order. Calligraphy became his first exercise in absolute focus. Every morning, he would prepare his own ink, rubbing a solid ink stick against a flat suzuri stone with a few drops of water. The rhythmic, circular motion of grinding the ink was a meditation in itself. The scent of the ink, earthy, piney, and old, filled the small room. When the ink was dark and thick enough, he would take his bamboo brush. He was taught that the brush was like a sword. The energy of the body had to flow through the shoulder, down the arm, and into the very tip of the bristles. On the thin rice paper, there was no room for error. If his mind strayed for even a second, the character would lose its balance. One moment of hesitation, and the stroke would be weak. It was here, with ink and paper, that the seeds of the warrior were planted. He learned that action, whether with a brush or a blade, must be preceded by a clear, focused emptiness. As the years passed, the physical world began to demand more of his strength. His training moved into the courtyard. Even in the biting cold of winter or the heavy humidity of summer, he practiced his footwork. He learned to move with economy, keeping his center of gravity low and his eyes steady on the horizon. He practiced with wooden sticks, the repetitive sounds of wood striking wood echoing through the trees. His life was sheltered from the outside world, yet it was a life of rigorous etiquette called reigi. Every bow was an act of discipline. The way he sat, the way he spoke, and even the way he breathed was governed by the need to show respect to the traditions of his house. The turning point of his young life came with the arrival of his 15th year, the ceremony of Genpuku. The estate was filled with the scent of sacred incense as the family gathered in the ancestral hall. This was the day the boy died, and the man was born. In a solemn ritual before the family altar, his childhood hair, which had been left long, was cut away. It was styled into the shanmaje, the traditional topknot of a samurai warrior. His childhood name, used only by his family, was cast aside forever. In its place, he was given an adult name, a name that would be recorded in the official registers of his lord. And then came the moment he had waited for since he first held a wooden toy, the presentation of the swords. His father, or perhaps the daimyo himself, presented him with the daisho, the long katana and the short wakizashi. As he tucked the heavy weapons into his silk belt for the first time, the weight was startling. It was the weight of responsibility, the weight of a life that was no longer his own. Standing before his elders, his head bowed, he was no longer a child of the inner chambers. He was a man of the warrior class. The path before him was long, narrow, and often difficult. But as he looked out into the rainy garden, he felt a deep, quiet resolve. The sword was now at his side, and the world was waiting for him to serve. The transition from the warmth of the sleeping quarters to the crisp, biting air of pre-dawn is the samurai's first act of discipline every day. Long before the sun begins to color the eastern sky, the estate is already stirring in silence. You walk across the wooden veranda, your feet cold against the polished timber. The morning mist hangs thick over the mossy stones of the garden, blurring the edges of the world. In the distance, the deep, resonant toll of a temple bell vibrates through the damp air. It is a sound that calls for awakening, not just of the body, but of the spirit. At the edge of the ground stands the dojo, a simple, rectangular structure built from dark, weathered cedar. It is a place of austerity. Inside, there are no cushions for comfort, no ornate paintings to distract the eye. The floor is an expanse of smooth, flawless wood, polished by the friction of thousands of bare feet over many decades. The air inside smells of old wood, cold dust, and the faint, lingering scent of incense from the kamidana. The kamidana, the small Shinto shrine on the far wall, is the spiritual anchor of the room. Before the training begins, every warrior bows toward it, acknowledging that the skills learned here are not for the ego, but are a sacred trust from the gods and the ancestors. In the center of the dojo stands the sensei. He is an older man, his hair gray and his face etched with the lines of a lifetime of focus. He does not speak much, for in the dojo, words are secondary to movement. He watches as the younger samurai begin their warm-up, his eyes sharp, noticing the slightest imbalance in their stance. He knows that a warrior's life can depend on the position of a single toe, or the tension in a single muscle. The training begins with kenjutsu, the art of the sword. But they do not start with steel. They take up the bakken, the heavy wooden practice sword carved from solid white oak. The weight of the wood is significant, designed to build the strength of the forearms and the stability of the core. The students line up in perfect rows. At the sensei's signal, they begin the suburi, the repetitive overhead strikes, 1,000 times. The sound of the wood cutting through the air is a rhythmic, snapping whistle. Swish, snap, swish, snap. By the 100th strike, the shoulders begin to ache. By the 500th, the breath is heavy and the sweat begins to sting the eyes. By the 800th, the body wants to stop, but this is the secret of the dojo. When the body is exhausted, the ego begins to fall away. The samurai stops thinking about the strike and simply becomes the strike. He finds a state of mushin no mind, where there is no past, no future, and no pain. Only the arc of the wood and the sound of the morning wind. From the sword, they move to kyujutsu, the way of the bow. This requires a different kind of stillness. The yumi, the traditional Japanese bow, is a towering instrument of bamboo and leather. It is asymmetric, the grip positioned below the center to allow it to be fired from horseback or a kneeling position. The archer stands before the target mato, his feet rooted deep into the floor. He lifts the bow high above his head and draws the string back in one fluid, circular motion. He does not aim with his eyes, he aims with his breathing. He holds the tension, the massive energy of the bamboo ready to explode. He waits for the moment of Hasetsu, the 8 stages of the shot. The release is not a conscious decision, it is a natural ripening. Like a drop of dew falling from a leaf when it becomes too heavy. The string snaps, the arrow flies, and the archer remains perfectly still, following the path of the arrow with his spirit. As the sun begins to rise, the light filtering through the paper screens turns a soft, glowing gold. The training shifts to Sojutsu, the art of the spear. The spear is a weapon of reach and terrifying speed. The samurai practices the thrust and the parry, his movements large and sweeping. He must learn to handle the long shaft as if it were a part of his own arm. Then the weapons are set aside for Jujutsu, the art of flexibility. This is the combat of the empty hand. The students pair off, grabbing each other's training robes. They learn to fall without injury, rolling across the hard wooden floor with a sound like distant thunder. Jujutsu is not about brute force, it is about yielding. If the opponent pushes, you pull. If the opponent pulls, you push. You become like water, flowing around the obstacle rather than trying to break through it. The samurai learns to feel the center of gravity of his opponent, finding the precise moment when a small nudge will lead to a massive fall. Finally, for those of higher rank, there is Bajutsu, the art of horsemanship. The horses are kept in the stables nearby, their low nickering a constant backdrop to the morning. The samurai must learn to ride without hands, controlling the powerful animal with only his knees and his balance. He must be able to fire an arrow or swing a blade while galloping at full speed. The connection between horse and rider must be absolute, a shared heartbeat in the heat of battle. As the morning session draws to a close, the students are drenched in sweat, their muscles trembling with fatigue, but their eyes are clear. The sensei signals for them to sit once more in zazen. The dojo returns to its state of perfect silence. The frantic energy of the training is gone, replaced by a deep, grounded peace. They have practiced the arts of death, but in doing so, they have found a deeper appreciation for the stillness of life. They bow one last time to the Kamidana, and then to their master. The morning has only just begun. But for the samurai, the most important work of the day, the work of the self, is already well underway. To understand the katana, you must first move beyond the concept of a weapon. In the world of the samurai, the sword was not a tool. It was an extension of the soul, a sacred object that bridged the gap between the material world and the spirit. The story of a blade begins not in a factory, but in a place of deep spiritual silence, the forge of the master swordsmith. Long before the first hammer strike, the swordsmith begins a process of purification. He bathes in cold water to cleanse his body, and he dons white robes, the color of death and rebirth. He hangs sacred Shimenawa ropes of rice straw and paper zigzags around his workspace to ward off evil spirits and invite the presence of the kami. The forge is a dark, cool space, dominated by the intense, glowing heart of the charcoal fire. The smith works in the dim light, because only in the darkness can he truly see the color of the heated steel. He watches for a specific shade of orange, like the rising sun, to know precisely when the metal is ready to be transformed. The material itself is tamahagen, the jewel steel. It is born from iron sand, smelted for 3 days and 3 nights in a clay furnace called a tatara. This precious iron is not uniform. It contains variations in carbon that the master smith must carefully select and blend. He takes the high carbon steel for the edge, where hardness is required to hold a razor-sharp line. And he takes a softer, low-carbon steel for the core, which will provide the blade with flexibility, allowing it to absorb the shock of a blow without shattering. This marriage of opposites, hardness and softness, is the secret of the katana's strength. The most hypnotic part of the process is the folding. The smith hammers the heated steel flat, cuts it, and folds it back upon itself. He repeats this process over and over, sometimes 15 times or more. With every fold, the number of layers doubles. By the time he is finished, the blade contains over 30,000 layers of steel. As you watch the smith work, the sound of the hammer becomes a rhythm that fills the estate. Clang, clang, clang. Each strike is a prayer. Each fold is a removal of impurities. Just as the samurai must fold his own ego and refine his character through years of discipline, the steel is purified by the fire and the hammer. The folding creates a subtle pattern on the surface of the steel known as the hada, the grain. Like the rings of an ancient tree or the current of a slow-moving river, the hada tells the story of the blade's creation. But the most critical moment, the moment of life or death for the blade, is the yakiire, the quenching. The smith covers the blade in a special mixture of clay, ash, and stone powder. He applies a thick layer to the spine and a thinner, more delicate layer to the edge. The blade is heated one last time until it glows with a fierce, internal light. Then, with a sudden, decisive motion, the smith plunges it into a trough of cool water. The sound is a violent, hissing scream as the steam erupts. In those few seconds, the blade undergoes a miraculous transformation. Because the thin clay on the edge allows it to cool almost instantly, the steel there becomes incredibly hard. The thick clay on the spine causes it to cool more slowly, remaining flexible. This difference in cooling speeds also causes the blade to curve naturally. It is as if the sword is pulling itself into its final, elegant shape. The boundary where the two types of steel meet creates the hamon, the beautiful, undulating frost pattern that runs along the edge of the katana. Once the blade is forged, it passes to the tajishi, the polisher. This process is as demanding as the forging itself, often taking over 100 hours of concentrated labor. The polisher sits over a wooden bench, using a series of progressively finer stones, many of them harvested from specific mountains in Japan. He begins with coarse stones to define the geometry of the blade, and moves toward stones as smooth as glass. With the finest stones, known as heizuya and jizuya, he works only on a few millimeters of steel at a time, using his thumb to apply the pressure. He does not just make it shiny. He reveals the internal structure of the steel, bringing out the contrast between the hard edge and the soft body. While the blade is the heart of the sword, the kashiri, the mountings, are its garments. The samurai chooses these with great care, for they reflect his personality and his status. The scabbard, or saya, is crafted from light hinoki wood and covered in dozens of layers of natural lacquer, cured in high humidity until it is as hard as stone. The guard, or tsuba, is a focal point of artistry. Made of iron or soft alloys like shakudo, it is often intricately carved with symbols of deep meaning. A tsuba might depict a lone dragon amidst clouds, representing the unpredictable nature of fate. Or it might show a simple cherry blossom, reminding the warrior of the beauty and fragility of a life that can end in an instant. The handle, the tsuka, is wrapped in the skin of a stingray and then bound with silk cord in a complex, overlapping diamond pattern. This provides a grip that will not slip, even in the heat and blood of battle. Tucked beneath the silk are small, decorative charms called menyuki, which sit comfortably in the palm and provide a tactile connection between the man and the metal. For the samurai, receiving his finished katana is a moment of profound gravity. From that day forward, the sword will never be far from his side. The relationship is one of absolute respect. To step over someone's sword or to touch it without permission is a grave insult. The sword is treated with the same reverence as an ancestor. Every evening, the samurai performs the ritual of maintenance. He sits in the quiet of his room, the rain pattering against the roof. He carefully removes the blade from its scabbard. Using a small silk cloth, he wipes away the old oil. Then he takes the yukaiko ball, a small silk bag filled with fine stone powder. He taps it gently along the length of the blade, leaving behind a light, white mist of powder. This powder removes any microscopic traces of moisture or oil that could lead to rust. Finally, he applies a fresh layer of chojai oil, a fragrant blend made from cloves. The scent of the cloves is sweet and spicy, filling the room with a sense of calm and order. As he looks at the reflection of the candle flame in the polished steel, he is reminded of his own mortality. The blade is timeless, but his life is fleeting. The katana is a reminder that beauty and lethality, life and death, are always intertwined. He returns the sword to its scabbard with a soft, metallic clack. He bows to the blade, and then he places it on its rack, the katana cake, where it will watch over him as he sleeps. In the silence of the night, the soul of the samurai and the soul of the steel are one. The rain continues to fall outside the estate, a steady, hypnotic drumming against the wooden eaves. Inside, the air is still. The samurai sits alone on the tatami, a single candle casting long, wavering shadows across the paper screens. The scent of damp earth and crushed pine needles drifts in through a narrow opening in the shoji door. Somewhere in the garden, a lone cricket begins its rhythmic, metallic chirp. This quiet room, smelling of old wood and sweet rush grass, is the true battlefield. Long before he faces an enemy in the mud and chaos of war, the warrior must conquer the geography of his own mind. He must learn to navigate the turbulent waters of fear, anger, and desire, anchoring himself to something immovable. He lives his life according to an unspoken, unwritten code. For centuries, during the endless violence of the Sengoku era, it had no formal name. It was simply the air the warrior class breathed, a practical, ruthless set of survival principles forged in blood and mud. But as the fires of war died down and the 250 years of Tokugawa peace began, the sword was traded for the brush. The raw instincts of the battlefield were refined, polished, and written down by scholars and philosophers. It became an idealized path, a spiritual compass. It became Bushidō, the way of the warrior. Bushidō is not a rigid list of rules carved into stone. It is a posture of the soul, a way of walking through a world that is inherently chaotic and violent, while maintaining a core of absolute, unbroken stillness. At the foundation of this way is the concept of gi, righteousness, or justice. For the samurai, there are no gray areas in matters of integrity. There is only right and wrong. To hesitate to weigh the personal cost of doing the right thing is a weakness. Gi demands that action flows instantly from truth, like water cutting through a valley. But justice without action is merely an idea. Therefore, gi is bound to you heroic courage. This is not the loud, boastful bravery of a tavern brawler. It is a quiet, terrifying resolve. True courage is doing what is right even when it means certain ruin. It is walking into the storm with a steady heartbeat, knowing you may not return. Yet, a warrior who possesses only justice and courage is little more than a dangerous weapon. He must also cultivate jin, benevolence and compassion. The samurai is granted the power of life and death, but with that power comes a profound spiritual burden. To kill without compassion is to lose one's humanity. Jin is the soft rain that nurtures the earth. It is the understanding that true strength is not found in dominating others, but in protecting the weak and showing mercy to the defeated. These internal virtues are made visible to the world through rei, deep respect and etiquette. The strict formalities of a samurai's life, the exact angle of a bow, the careful way a tea bowl is passed, are not empty theater. They are the physical manifestation of a respectful heart. Rei prevents the warrior class from descending into barbarism. It ensures that even in the face of an enemy, even in the final moments before blades are drawn, there is a mutual recognition of humanity. The warrior's word is his bond, anchored by Makoto, absolute sincerity and honesty. A samurai has no need to promise. He has no need to swear oaths to the gods. If he says a thing will be done, it is as good as finished. To speak is to act. All of these virtues serve to protect his meiyo, his honor. Honor is the samurai's most precious possession, more valuable than land, wealth, or life itself. It is fragile as glass, easily shattered by a single cowardly act or a dishonest word. Once lost, it can rarely be regained in life. When honor was irreparably broken, or when a samurai needed to take ultimate responsibility for a failure, there was only one path left to restore balance: the ritual of seppuku. It was a solemn, deeply formalized act of self-sacrifice. It was not an act of despair, but an act of supreme control. Dressed in pure white robes, kneeling on a square of white silk, the samurai would compose a jais, a final death poem. He would reflect on the changing seasons, the falling cherry blossoms, or the fleeting nature of the world. And then, with a steady hand, he would end his own life, washing away the stain on his honor and preserving the dignity of his family name. And binding all these pillars together is chugi, unwavering loyalty. The samurai does not belong to himself. He belongs to his lord. This loyalty is not conditional. It does not waver when the lord is unjust or when the domain is failing. It is a fierce, gravitational pull that gives the warrior's life its shape and its purpose. But to truly embody Bushidō, the samurai must confront the one reality that terrifies all living creatures. He must confront death. In the early 18th century, a samurai named Yamamoto Tsunetomo dictated a text that would capture the stark, uncompromising heart of this philosophy. The text was called the Hagakure, hidden by the leaves. Its most famous line is as sharp and cold as a winter blade. The way of the samurai is found in death. To modern ears, this sounds morbid, a dark obsession with the end of life. But to the samurai sitting in the quiet room, it is the ultimate liberation. The Hagakure teaches that every morning, the warrior must meditate upon his own demise. He must imagine himself falling in battle, being struck by arrows, drowning in freezing water, or being consumed by fire. He must visualize his death so vividly that it ceases to be a future fear and becomes a present reality. If a man considers himself already dead, he has nothing left to lose. He is no longer bound by the anxiety of survival. He is free from the hesitant, nervous calculations that plague ordinary men. A dead man does not fear pain. A dead man does not worry about his reputation or his wealth. A dead man can act with perfect, terrifying clarity. By accepting death, the samurai paradoxically learns how to fully live. He is awake to the profound beauty of the present moment. The taste of hot tea, the sound of the rain, the intricate grain of his sword's steel. All of these become intensely vivid when you know they could be your last experience on Earth. This is the great secret of the warrior's calm. It is not the absence of fear, but the deep, meditative acceptance of the inevitable. The candle in the room flickers, casting a warm light against the paper screens. The samurai breathes in the damp night air. He is ready for whatever the dawn may bring. Whether it brings peace or violence, life or death, he will meet it with the same quiet, unshakable grace. For the samurai, the physical world of swords and armor is only half of his reality. The true battle, the one that determines his ultimate victory or defeat, is fought in the silence of his own mind. This is the realm of Zen. It is not a religion of distant gods or complex theology. It is a practice of profound, unyielding observation. The foundation of this practice is Zazen, seated meditation. Before dawn, when the world is still cloaked in shadows and the air is sharp and cold, the samurai enters a quiet room. He folds his legs into the lotus position on a simple round cushion called a zafu. He rests his hands in his lap, the thumbs lightly touching, forming an unbroken circle of energy. He straightens his spine, imagining a string pulling the crown of his head toward the heavens. He lowers his gaze, letting his eyes rest softly on the tatami mat a few feet ahead. And then he simply breathes. He does not try to stop his thoughts, for trying to stop the mind only creates more noise. Instead, he watches his thoughts rise and fall, like ripples expanding on the surface of a pond. Anger, fear, memories of the past, anxieties about the future, they all appear. But he does not cling to them. He lets them pass, returning his focus entirely to the slow, measured rhythm of his breath. Through Zazen, the warrior seeks a state known as Mushin no mind. It is a state of absolute emptiness, but it is not a dead, vacant void. It is an emptiness that is fully awake. When the mind is empty of ego and distraction, it can reflect the world perfectly, like a calm mirror. In battle, a samurai with Mushin does not think about his opponent's sword, or his own technique, or whether he will live or die. He acts instinctively, his body moving with the fluid, effortless power of a breaking wave. But Zen is not confined to the meditation cushion. It spills out into every aspect of the samurai's life. It is found in the careful, deliberate movements of the chanoyu, the tea ceremony. The tea room is a small, rustic hut often separated from the main house by a stone path. The entrance is intentionally low, forcing anyone who enters, even a powerful lord, to bow their head in humility. Inside, the light is dim. There is no grand furniture, only the soft glow of the charcoal brazier and the quiet hum of the iron kettle heating the water. The samurai sits in silence as the tea master begins the preparation. Every motion is precise, practiced, and deeply mindful. The folding of the silk cloth, the scooping of the bright green matcha powder, the whisking of the tea until a light foam rises to the surface. When the bowl is offered to the samurai, he accepts it with both hands. It is not an ornate cup of gold or silver. It is made of simple clay, perhaps misshapen, bearing the marks of the potter's fire. This is the aesthetic of wabi-sabi. It is the profound appreciation of things that are imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. The rough texture of the bowl reminds the warrior that true beauty is found in the natural, unpolished state of the world. He turns the bowl, admiring its unique flaws. He takes a slow sip, tasting the bitter, earthy flavor of the tea. In this single, quiet moment, there is no past and no future. There is only the warmth of the bowl in his hands and the sound of the wind outside. This same philosophy extends to the space surrounding the tea house, the Kairsensui, or dry landscape garden. Unlike the lush, blooming gardens of the West, the Zen garden is a study in minimalism. It consists only of rocks, moss, and white gravel. Every morning, a monk or a samurai will use a heavy wooden rake to carefully draw deep, parallel lines through the gravel. The raking itself is a form of moving meditation, requiring absolute focus to keep the lines straight and even. The gravel represents the vast ocean. The rocks, carefully placed in asymmetrical clusters, represent islands or mountains rising from the sea. The samurai sits on the wooden veranda, gazing out over the garden. There are no flowers to distract the eye, no moving water to break the silence. It is a landscape stripped down to its barest essentials. As he stares into the raked patterns, the boundaries between himself and the garden begin to dissolve. The stillness of the stones enters his bones. The vastness of the gravel ocean expands within his own mind. He realizes that the garden is not something to be looked at. It is a mirror, reflecting the quiet, boundless nature of his own spirit. Whether he is gripping a sword, whisking a bowl of tea, or simply watching the rain, the goal is always the same: to be entirely present, to empty the cup of the mind, so that it may be filled with the truth of the moment. The temple bell rings in the distance, a low, reverberating sound that slowly fades into the damp air. The samurai breathes in, and the world breathes with him. History often paints the world of the samurai as an exclusively male domain of warlords, swordsmen, and political schemers. But behind the heavy wooden gates of every great estate, there existed a different kind of warrior. The women of the samurai class carried a burden that was quieter, but no less absolute than the men who rode out to war. Their battlefield was not the open plains of Sengoku, Japan. It was the household. And their courage was forged not only in steel, but in the unbreakable resolve to protect their lineage. From childhood, a samurai daughter was raised with the same strict discipline as her brothers. While the boys were handed wooden swords, she was taught the intricate rituals of the tea ceremony, the arts of calligraphy, and the complex rules of etiquette. But she was also taught the way of the naginata. The naginata was a long polearm with a curved blade at the end. It was an elegant, sweeping weapon, perfectly suited to keep a larger, stronger attacker at bay. The young woman trained in the courtyard, her silk robes tied back, learning to spin the long shaft with devastating speed and precision. She was not training to march into foreign lands. She was training to defend her home. When the daimyo called the men to war, the estates were left virtually empty. The defense of the castle, the management of the food stores, and the protection of the children fell entirely upon the women. In these moments, they were known as anabugeisha, female martial artists. If enemy forces breached the outer walls, the samurai woman did not flee. She stood her ground at the inner gates, her naginata in hand, prepared to die exactly as her husband would on the front lines. But combat was only a fraction of her duty. The true weight of her life was the administration of the estate. She managed the finances, oversaw the servants, and ensured the lands produced enough rice to pay the lord's taxes. She was the silent engine that kept the feudal system running. Perhaps her most vital role, however, was that of a mother. It was the mother, not the absent father, who instilled the terrifying, beautiful concepts of Bushidō into the minds of the next generation. She taught her sons not to cry when they were hurt. She taught her daughters to suppress their own desires for the good of the family. She told them stories of ancestors who had chosen death over dishonor, ensuring that the bloodline remained pure in spirit. Her emotional control had to be absolute. If news arrived from the battlefield that her husband or her eldest son had been killed, she was not permitted to weep in public. To show grief was considered a weakness, a failure to understand that death in service to the Lord was the ultimate honor. She would accept the messenger's words with a blank, stone-like face. Only in the deepest hours of the night, alone in her chambers, might she allow the tears to fall in silence. Just as the men had the ritual of seppuku to restore honor, the women had their own solemn equivalent, known as jigai. If the castle was destined to fall, and capture by the enemy was imminent, the samurai woman would not allow herself or her daughters to become prisoners. In the dim light of the inner sanctum, she would tie her legs together with a silk cord. This was to ensure that, even in the agonizing throes of death, her body would be found in a dignified posture. Using a short dagger called a tanto, she would cut the veins in her neck. It was a final, terrible act of autonomy, a refusal to surrender her fate to anyone else. The samurai woman was a pillar of the feudal order. Without her stoic resilience, her quiet management, and her willingness to shed blood in defense of the hearth, the warrior class could not have survived. As the rain falls gently over the rooftops of the estate, the soft rustle of her silk robes can be heard moving through the corridors. She is walking the rounds, checking the locks, her eyes sharp in the darkness. She is the invisible steel of Japan. To understand the samurai, you must understand the gravity of loyalty. A warrior is defined by the lord he serves. His identity, his income, his honor, and his very right to exist are tied to a single, unshakable bond. But what happens when that bond is broken? What happens to the warrior when there is no longer a master to serve? He becomes a Rōnin. The word literally translates to wave man. It paints a vivid, melancholy picture. A man drifting on the currents of the world, unanchored, tossed about by forces beyond his control, with no shore to call his own. There were many ways a samurai could fall into this existence. Sometimes, a daimyo would die without leaving a male heir, and the shogunate would confiscate the domain, instantly leaving hundreds of retainers without a master. Other times, a lord might fall out of favor with the shogun. For a political misstep or a failure of duty, the lord might be ordered to commit seppuku and his land seized. And occasionally, a samurai might simply be dismissed for a personal failure, cast out of the gates of the estate with nothing but the swords at his side. In a society built upon rigid hierarchy and absolute order, to be a Rōnin was to become a ghost. You belonged nowhere. You had no lord to feed you, no castle to defend, and no clear purpose for your blade. The physical reality of this transition was harsh. The samurai would have to surrender his stipends of rice, pack his few belongings, and leave the estate that had been his family's home for generations. He would trade his fine silk kimono for rough, travel-worn cotton. He would don the amigasa, a deep, woven straw hat that obscured his face, hiding his shame from the world. And he would begin to walk. Japan in the Edo period was connected by great highways, like the Kyoto Road. These roads were lined with ancient pine trees, misty mountains, and small post towns. The Rōnin would walk these roads in the rain, the mud clinging to his straw sandals, his two swords wrapped securely in oilcloth to prevent rust. Without a stipend, starvation was a constant threat. To survive, the masterless warrior had very few options. He was forbidden by his class status from farming the land or opening a shop. He was a man trained only in the arts of administration and death. Many turned to selling their skills as mercenaries. They became yojimbo, bodyguards. A Rōnin might hire himself out to protect a wealthy merchant's caravan from bandits. This was a bitter pill to swallow. According to the strict Confucian class system, merchants were at the very bottom of society, considered parasites who produced nothing and only profited from the labor of others. To bow to a merchant, to take his coins, and to draw a sacred blade to protect his cargo was a profound humiliation. It was a daily reminder of how far the warrior had fallen. Some Rōnin could not bear the indignity. Stripped of their honor and desperate for food, they abandoned the Bushidō code entirely. They became the very bandits they were once sworn to hunt. They formed roaming gangs, terrorizing isolated farming villages, stealing rice, and using their lethal training to exploit the weak. These fallen men were despised by society, hunted down by the authorities, and executed without mercy when caught. But there was another path. A path of tragic, isolated purity. Some Rōnin refused to let the loss of a master destroy their internal compass. They realized that while external honor, the prestige of a clan, was gone, internal honor remained. These wandering ascetics traveled from province to province, not to find employment, but to perfect their art. They would visit the dojos of different schools, challenging the masters to duels. Not out of malice, but to test their own spirit against the sharpest edges in the country. The most famous of all Rōnin was Miyamoto Musashi. Born in the turbulent years before the Tokugawa peace, Musashi never served a lord for long. He chose the life of the wave man. He walked the roads of Japan dirty and unkempt, caring nothing for appearance or comfort. He fought over 60 duels to the death, and he never lost. Musashi did not seek a master to give him purpose. He found his purpose in the absolute mastery of the sword itself. In his final years, living alone in a dark, dripping cave called Rigando, he wrote the Book of 5 Rings, a masterpiece of strategy and philosophy. He proved that a samurai without a lord was not necessarily a broken man. If his spirit was strong enough, he could become a force of nature. Yet Musashi was the exception, a mythic archetype that transcended the tragic reality of his class. For the vast majority of masterless warriors, the life of a Rōnin was one of quiet, gnawing sorrow. In the evenings, when the rain finally stopped and the mist settled in the valleys, the Rōnin would find shelter in a cheap roadside inn. He would sit by the fire, drinking cheap sake from a chipped cup. He would take out his katana, wiping away the moisture of the road, applying the fragrant clove oil. The blade was still flawless. It was still sharp enough to cut through a falling silk scarf. But the man holding it was slowly rusting away. The Rōnin lived in a state of profound paradox. He possessed the ultimate freedom. He could walk anywhere, sleep under any tree, and answer to no one. But for a man raised to believe that his highest calling was to die for his Lord, this absolute freedom was a heavy, terrifying burden. Without a master to die for, the Rōnin faced a much more difficult task. He had to figure out how to live. To truly comprehend the samurai, one must step out of the quiet dojo, away from the serene Zen gardens, and descend into the absolute chaos of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. For over a century, Japan was a burning theater of near-constant warfare. The elegance of the tea ceremony and the discipline of calligraphy were ultimately in service of one terrifying reality: the battlefield. The preparation for war began long before the first arrow was knocked. Inside the dim, wooden halls of the estate, the samurai would prepare his armor, the yorj. Dressing for battle was a slow, deliberate ritual, almost religious in its gravity. The armor was not a solid sheet of heavy steel like the knights of Europe. It was a masterpiece of flexibility and terrifying beauty, composed of hundreds of small iron and leather scales, woven tightly together with thick, colorful silk cords. As the servants helped him tie the armor over his kimono, the samurai felt the heavy, protective embrace of the scales. Finally, he would don the kabuto, the horned helmet, and tie the fearsome iron mask, the mempo, over his face. The mask was designed to look like a sneering demon or a scowling ghost. It had a dual purpose: to protect the face from glancing blows and to strip away the warrior's human identity. Once the mask was tied, the man was gone. Only the warrior remained. A feudal battlefield was a sensory nightmare. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of trampled earth, burning wood, and sweat. The silence of the morning would be shattered by the deep, mournful bellow of the horogai, a massive conch shell blown by a priest to signal the advance. This was answered by the steady, terrifying boom of the taiko drums, beating like the pulse of a massive, angry beast. Across the valley, the armies would face each other. These were not small skirmishes. Tens of thousands of men stood in formation. The sky was a forest of long spears and tall, colorful banners called sashimon, strapped to the backs of the warriors to identify their clans in the confusion of combat. While the samurai class led the charge, the bulk of the army consisted of ashigaru, the light foot soldiers. Conscripted from the peasantry, they fought with long pikes, creating impenetrable walls of sharp steel. But the true terror of the late Sengoku period was the introduction of the teppo, the matchlock rifle. Brought to Japan by Portuguese traders, These crude firearms changed the nature of war forever. When the volley fired, a deafening crack would roll across the field, followed by a thick, acrid cloud of white sulfur smoke. A peasant who had trained for only a few weeks could suddenly pierce the exquisite, ancient armor of a master swordsman from 100 yards away. Through this smoke and deafening noise, the samurai cavalry would charge. Riding swift, sturdy Japanese horses, they crashed into the enemy lines like a tidal wave. Combat was brutal, intimate, and fast. The katana, drawn only when the spear was broken or the fighting became impossibly close, flashed in the gray light. There was no room for the philosophical musings of the dojo here. There was only muscle memory, adrenaline, and the desperate primal instinct to survive. The goal of the individual samurai was not just to win the battle, but to achieve personal glory for his family name. In the heat of combat, a warrior would often shout his lineage across the lines, challenging an enemy of equal rank to single combat. And the grim reality of this glory was the taking of trophies. When a samurai defeated a worthy opponent, he would decapitate him. The head was a bloody receipt of his valor, proof of his courage to be presented to his lord after the battle. After the fighting stopped, the fields were a landscape of absolute devastation. The mud was slick with blood. The bright silk armor was torn and stained. In the heavy silence that follows a great slaughter, the survivors would sit among the dead. The adrenaline would fade, replaced by a cold, hollow exhaustion. The samurai would look at his blade, notched and dull from striking bone and armor. He had survived to see another sunset. He had done his duty to his lord. But as he wiped the blood from his sword and sheathed it in the growing dark, the weight of the Bushidō code rested heavily on his shoulders. He knew that this peace was only temporary. As long as he carried the two swords, the battlefield would always be waiting. The Bushidō code demanded that a samurai fight in the open. He was expected to declare his name, announce his lineage, and face his enemy under the light of the sun. But war is rarely won entirely in the light. Behind the glorious cavalry charges and the rigid rules of honor, there existed a dark, pragmatic underworld that powered the Sengoku period. This was the domain of the Shinobi. Today, the world knows them as ninja. The myth paints them as magical assassins, leaping over castle walls in black silk, vanishing in clouds of smoke. The reality was far more grounded, far more terrifying, and infinitely more disciplined. The Shinobi were not supernatural beings. They were intelligence operatives, saboteurs, and masters of psychological warfare. They originated in the rugged, mountainous provinces of Iga and Koga, isolated regions where tight-knit families developed highly specialized skills in espionage, to survive against larger, wealthier warlords. For a samurai, the greatest fear was losing his honor. For a shinobi, honor was an illusion that got men killed. The only thing that mattered was the success of the mission. This created a deeply hypocritical relationship between the two classes. A powerful daimyo would stand in his great hall and loudly condemn the cowardly tactics of spies and assassins. Yet late at night, that same lord would secretly hire a shinobi clan to poison a rival's water supply, set fire to an enemy's food stores, or kidnap a key general. The samurai fought for glory, the shinobi fought for results. The training of a shinobi, known as ninjutsu, was a lifetime of brutal physical and psychological conditioning. It began in early childhood. They were taught to dislocate their own joints to escape from ropes. They learned to control their breathing so perfectly that they could hide underwater for agonizing stretches of time using only a hollow reed. They practiced walking on rice paper without tearing it, and stepping on dry leaves without making a sound. They learned to read the weather, the stars, and the subtle changes in animal behavior to predict the movement of enemy troops. Their most powerful weapon, however, was not the sword. It was disguise. A shinobi rarely wore a black mask and suit. To dress like an assassin was to invite capture. Instead, they became invisible by hiding in plain sight. They infiltrated enemy provinces disguised as wandering Buddhist monks, traveling merchants, street performers, or simple peasant farmers. They would spend months, sometimes years, living a fabricated life in an enemy town, patiently listening to rumors in the local taverns, observing the guard rotations at the castle, and mapping the weaknesses in the defenses. When the time came to strike, their tools were pragmatic and often agricultural. The famous kanai was not originally a throwing knife. It was a simple masonry trowel, perfect for digging under walls or prying open heavy wooden doors. The shuriken, the throwing star, was rarely used to kill. Coated in dirt or mild toxins, it was thrown into the darkness to create a distraction, or at the legs of pursuing guards to slow them down. Their primary offensive tactic was fire. In a country where castles and cities were built almost entirely of wood and paper, arson was a weapon of mass destruction. A single shinobi, slipping over a wall on a windy night with a flint and a handful of gunpowder, could destroy a fortress that an army of 10,000 samurai could not breach. The psychological toll of this life was immense. The shinobi lived in a state of constant deception. They could not claim the glory of their victories. If a samurai died in battle, songs were sung of his bravery. If a shinobi was caught, he was tortured for information and executed in anonymous disgrace. They were expected to swallow a vial of poison or bite off their own tongues, rather than reveal the secrets of their clan. Despite their vast differences, the samurai and the shinobi shared a strange, symbiotic existence. They were two sides of the same violent coin. The samurai represented the rigid, structural order of feudal Japan, while the shinobi navigated its chaotic, hidden currents. When the Sengoku period finally ended, and the Tokugawa shogunate brought 2.5 centuries of peace, the demand for both classes evaporated. The samurai struggled to adapt, transforming slowly into bureaucrats and administrators, carrying swords they would never use. But the shinobi faced a different fate. Without wars to fight or intelligence to gather, they simply faded away. Some became security guards for the shogun. Others returned to farming the rocky soil of the Iga Mountains. They left behind very few written records. They built no great monuments. True to their training, when their mission in history was complete, they dissolved back into the shadows, leaving only myths and whispers behind. To understand the samurai spirit at its absolute limit, one must look beyond the battlefield and the dojo. One must look at the quiet mechanics of honor and the lengths a warrior would go to preserve it. For a samurai, the end of life was not the worst possible outcome. A life lived without honor was a far heavier burden. When a samurai's honor was irrevocably compromised, whether through a failure in duty or the command of his lord, the only way to restore balance to his world was through seppuku. It was not viewed as an act of despair, but rather a profoundly solemn, beautiful ritual of returning to the void. The samurai would bathe in cold water and dress in a pure white kimono, the color of winter snow and spiritual purity. He would kneel quietly on a white silk cushion, surrounded by the absolute silence of trusted witnesses. Before him, on a simple wooden tray, lay a short blade wrapped in delicate rice paper. Before the final act, he would calm his breathing, grind his ink, and compose his jaisa, his final death poem. In elegant calligraphy, he would write of the changing seasons, the falling cherry blossoms, or the fleeting, dreamlike nature of the world. Standing quietly behind him was the kaishaku nin, a trusted friend or a highly skilled swordsman. This second was there as an act of deep compassion, to ensure the samurai passed instantly into the next life, without enduring prolonged suffering. With a single, flawless motion, the ritual would conclude in absolute silence, preserving the warrior's dignity and washing away all worldly transgressions. This extreme devotion to honor reached its historical pinnacle in the year 1701, in a story that still echoes through the quiet temples of Japan, the tale of the 47 Rōnin. A young lord named Asano was summoned to the shogun's palace in Edo. There, he was repeatedly provoked and humiliated by a corrupt court official named Kira. Pushed beyond the limits of his patience, Asano drew his sword inside the palace walls. It was an unforgivable offense. Asano was immediately ordered to commit the ritual of seppuku, and his lands were quietly confiscated. Overnight, his 300 samurai retainers were stripped of their master and their home. They became Rōnin, drifting wave men. Most dispersed into the countryside, vanishing into the mist. But 47 of them, led by Asano's chief retainer, Oishi, made a secret, unbreakable vow. According to the laws of the Shōgunate, seeking retribution was strictly forbidden. But according to the deep, silent laws of Bushidō, failing to answer for a fallen master was an eternal shadow on the soul. The 47 chose Bushidō. They knew that Kira, expecting retaliation, had heavily fortified his mansion. So the Rōnin played a long, agonizing game of patience. For nearly 2 years, they scattered. They disguised themselves as wandering merchants, monks, and laborers. Oishi, their leader, moved to Kyoto and purposely ruined his own reputation. He spent his nights drinking heavily in taverns, acting like a man who had entirely forgotten his honor. Spies watching him reported back to Kira that the Rōnin were broken, harmless men. Slowly the tension eased, and Kira relaxed his guard. Then, on a bitterly cold, completely silent night in December, as heavy snow fell over the city of Edo, the 47 Rōnin gathered. They shed their disguises and put on the dark armor of their fallen clan. Moving like shadows through the falling snow, they entered Kira's mansion. They moved with terrifying precision and discipline, subduing the guards and fulfilling their long-awaited vow. When the night was over, the 47 Rōnin did not flee into the darkness. They marched calmly through the snow-covered streets of the sleeping city to Sengakuji Temple, where they knelt before the grave of Lord Asano to announce that their duty was complete. They then turned themselves in to the authorities, sitting quietly to await the shogun's judgment. The shogun was caught in a profound paradox. These men had broken the highest law of the land. But in doing so, they had perfectly embodied the absolute purity of samurai loyalty. Rather than executing them as common criminals, the shogun granted them the highest possible honor. He allowed all 47 to depart this world through the dignity of seppuku. On a quiet spring day, the Rōnin knelt in the peaceful courtyards of the lords who held them. Without hesitation, they composed their final poems and followed their master into the calm void. They were buried side by side in a neat row at Sengakuji Temple, under the shade of the ancient trees, right next to Lord Asano. The 47 Rōnin were no longer masterless. They had transcended the physical world, becoming quiet, eternal symbols of a devotion that demanded everything and promised nothing but peace in return. For 2.5 centuries, the the Tokugawa Shogunate held Japan in a grip of absolute peace. The civil wars of the Sengoku era faded into distant memory, preserved only in ink on scrolls, and the stories told around winter fires. During this long, quiet period, the samurai underwent a profound transformation. Without wars to fight, the men of the warrior class slowly laid down their spears and picked up the brush. They became bureaucrats, scholars, and administrators, managing the complex rice economy of the nation. They still wore their two swords, the eternal symbols of their class, every time they stepped outside their homes. But for many, the blades were polished, oiled, and beautiful, yet completely untested in battle. The samurai had become a warrior in a world that no longer required war. But this long, isolated dream was about to be violently interrupted. In the summer of 1853, the horizon off the coast of Edo Bay darkened. Four massive vessels, unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen, sailed into the harbor. They were the Kurofune, the Black Ships, commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States. They were heavily armed steam frigates, painted pitch black, belching thick, dark smoke into the clear blue sky. To the samurai standing on the shore, the ships looked like iron monsters breathing fire. But what was truly terrifying was not the smoke or the noise. It was the realization of what those ships represented. For over 200 years, Japan had deliberately isolated itself from the rest of the world, maintaining a policy known as Sakoku, the closed country. During that time, the West had undergone an industrial revolution. The samurai, with their beautiful silk armor, masterfully folded katanas, and matchlock rifles, were suddenly face to face with steam power, steel hulls, and modern, rifled cannons capable of destroying a castle from miles away. The Black Ships brought a simple, undeniable message: open your borders to trade, or face the devastating power of the modern world. This ultimatum sent an existential shockwave through the entire samurai class. How could a warrior, sworn to protect his land, fight against a mountain of iron that fired explosive shells? A deep, bitter division tore through the country. The Shogunate, realizing they were hopelessly outgunned, signed treaties to open the ports. But many samurai, particularly those from the southern domains of Satsuma and Choshu, felt this was the ultimate betrayal of Japanese honor. A new, fierce ideology swept through the younger warriors. It was called Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. These young samurai believed that the shogun had lost the right to rule by submitting to foreign powers. They wanted to restore the emperor to real political power and drive the Western ships back into the sea with the pure, unyielding spirit of the sword. The streets of Kyoto, the ancient imperial capital, became a battleground of shadows and assassinations. Masterless Rōnin from the south prowled the dark alleys, hunting down officials of the shogunate. In response to this terror, the shogunate formed a specialized police force known as the Shinsengumi. Dressed in distinctive pale blue coats with white mountain patterns on the sleeves, the Shinsengumi were ruthless, highly skilled swordsmen tasked with maintaining order by any means necessary. They fought desperately to preserve the old order, enforcing the laws of the shogun with lightning-fast blades in the cramped, blood-stained streets of the city. But courage and sword skill, no matter how profound, could not turn back the tide of time. The world had moved on. Even the most traditional samurai soon realized that to expel the barbarians, they would have to learn from them. The southern domains began secretly purchasing modern rifles, Gatling guns, and Western military uniforms. The tragedy of the samurai Twilight had begun. They were forced to set aside the sacred katana and pick up mass-produced rifles. The soul of the warrior, previously tied to the masterful craftsmanship of a single blade, was now confronted with the cold, impersonal math of industrial warfare. Japan was hurtling toward a massive, bloody civil war. It would be a war fought not just for the control of the country, but for the very soul of its people. A war that would finally draw the curtain on the age of the samurai. The tension that had been building since the arrival of the black ships finally broke in 1868. The political maneuvering and the shadows of assassination gave way to open conflict. This was the Boshin War. A bitter, tragic civil war fought not just for the control of Japan, but to determine whether the nation would remain anchored in its feudal past or rush headlong into the industrial future. On one side stood the forces of the failing Tokugawa shogunate, fighting desperately to preserve the rigid order that had ruled for 2.5 centuries. On the other side stood the imperial army, primarily composed of warriors from the southern domains of Satsuma and Choshu. They fought under the banner of the young Emperor Meiji, and their goal was absolute modernization. The battlefields of the Boshin War were a surreal, heartbreaking collision of eras. Traditional samurai, wearing ancient, beautiful silk-laced armor and carrying swords forged by grandmasters, charged into the smoke. But they were not met by a volley of arrows or the clash of rival steel. They were met by the relentless, mechanical roar of Western Gatling guns, modern artillery, and highly disciplined infantry lines firing breech-loading rifles. Courage, no matter how profound, cannot cut through a barrage of exploding iron. The ancient ways were systematically dismantled by the cold efficiency of the modern world. The shogun's forces suffered a series of devastating defeats. As the imperial army marched toward the great city of Edo, the capital of the shogunate, total destruction seemed inevitable. But in a rare moment of grace, a bloody siege was avoided. realizing that a massive battle would only destroy the city and weaken Japan before the watching Western powers. The Shōgunate surrendered Edo Castle peacefully. With the fall of Edo, the old world officially died. The city was renamed Tokyo, the eastern capital. The emperor moved from his ancient palace in Kyoto to take residence in the new center of power. The Meiji Restoration had begun. The new government realized that if Japan was to avoid being colonized by the European empires, it had to modernize at a terrifying breakneck pace. Telegraph lines were strung across the countryside. Railroad tracks were laid through the ancient mountains. Western suits replaced the silk kimono, and a modern, conscripted national army replaced the samurai class. For a time, the samurai retained their status in name, but their foundation was crumbling. The new government simply could not afford to pay the stipends of hundreds of thousands of warriors who produced nothing. The final, devastating blow came not on a battlefield, but in a government decree. In 1876, the Heidore Edict was passed. It made it illegal for anyone outside of the military or police to carry a sword in public. For centuries, the twin blades tucked into the sash were the very soul of the samurai. They were the physical manifestation of his honor, his history, and his right to rule. Now, he was forced to leave them on a rack inside his home. To step outside without his swords was a profound psychological amputation. He was no longer a samurai, he was just a man. Adding to this quiet humiliation, the government strongly encouraged the cutting of the chanmaje, the traditional top knot. In the dim light of their homes, proud warriors sat before a mirror and took a blade not to their enemies, but to their own hair. The severing of the top knot was a symbolic death. It was the visual surrender of a 1,000-year lineage. Stripped of their stipends, their swords, and their appearance, many fell into poverty. Masters of the blade were forced to become farmers, merchants, or low-level clerks just to survive in the new, industrialized Tokyo. The world had moved on, leaving them behind like ghosts lingering in the morning mist. But the spirit of the warrior class was not entirely broken. In the deep south of Japan, in the province of Satsuma, a storm was gathering. There were men who refused to let the age of the sword end with the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen. They would demand one final, tragic stand. The modern world did not simply walk into Japan, it broke down the doors. And while the government in Tokyo embraced the telegraph and the steam train, deep in the southern province of Satsuma, a quiet fury was beginning to boil. For the men who had spent their entire lives mastering the sword, the new world was not just an insult. It was an erasure of their soul. At the center of this discontent was a man named Seigo Takamori. He was a massive, imposing figure with deep, sorrowful eyes. Ironically, he had been one of the greatest heroes of the Meiji Restoration. He had helped put the emperor in power to save Japan from foreign invasion. But as he watched the new government systematically dismantle the warrior class, stripping them of their stipends and their right to carry swords, his heart broke. He realized that in order to save the country, they were destroying its spirit. In 1877, that broken spirit ignited into the Satsuma Rebellion. Thousands of disgruntled samurai rallied around Seigo. They did not hate the emperor. They believed he was being misled by corrupt modern politicians. In a desperate, romantic, and ultimately doomed gesture, they took up arms to preserve the soul of old Japan. The war that followed was a brutal collision of two timelines. The imperial army was a modern, conscripted force of ordinary peasants, dressed in Western uniforms and armed with rifles and cannons. Against them marched the samurai of Satsuma. Though they initially used rifles, as their ammunition ran low, they reverted to the weapons of their ancestors. They threw off their modern coats. They drew their ancestral katanas. And with terrifying, primal war cries, they charged into the smoke of the artillery. For a brief moment, the sheer psychological terror of a samurai charge broke the lines of the peasant conscripts. But the math of the industrial age is unforgiving. Flesh and steel cannot conquer lead and fire forever. The rebellion was steadily crushed, pushing Seigo and his forces back into the mountains of Satsuma, until only a few hundred men remained. The final act of the samurai class took place on a steep hill called Shirayama. Seigo Takamori and his last 500 warriors were completely surrounded by an imperial army of 30,000 men. The modern forces had dug trenches and set up Gatling guns and heavy artillery, pointing directly at the small rebel camp on the hill. The night before the final battle was profoundly calm. There was no panic among the samurai. They spent their final hours drinking cups of cold water together, an ancient ritual performed by men who do not expect to return. They knew they could not win. But winning was no longer the point. The point was to show the new world how a samurai dies. Just before dawn, the imperial artillery opened fire. The bombardment shook the earth, shattering the trees of Shirayama into splinters. Then the artillery stopped, and from the smoke of the burning forest, the last samurai emerged. They charged down the mountain. They did not fire a single shot. They ran headlong into the teeth of the Gatling guns with their swords raised, their armor gleaming in the rising sun. It was a massacre. The imperial lines erupted in a wall of lead, cutting the charging warriors down in seconds. During the charge, Seigo Takamori was struck by a bullet in the hip and stomach. Knowing his end had come, he did not allow himself to be captured. He found a quiet patch of grass, turned to face the direction of the emperor's palace in Tokyo, and knelt. With the help of his most trusted friend acting as his second, Seigo committed seppuku on the battlefield, restoring his honor and returning to the void. When the fighting finally stopped, a strange, heavy silence fell over Shirayama. The imperial soldiers, the very men who had just fired the cannons and the Gatling guns, walked among the fallen bodies. And many of them began to weep. They wept because they understood what had just happened. They had won the war. They had secured the future of a modern Japan. But in doing so, they had just killed the last true heroes of their nation. The age of the sword was over. The age of the machine had begun. The smoke finally cleared over the hill of Shirayama. The guns fell silent, and the great swords were locked away in dark wooden chests. By the turn of the 20th century, the samurai, as a physical, breathing class of warriors, had vanished from the earth. But their death was only a physical one. You cannot erase 1,000 years of history with a single law. The soul of the samurai, the unspoken, unyielding code of Bushidō, did not die. It simply sank deeper into the foundation of the nation. As Japan modernized at a terrifying pace, building factories and dreadnoughts, a deep anxiety took hold. The people feared they were losing their identity to the West. In response, scholars and writers began to romanticize the lost age of the sword. In the year 1900, a man named Nitobe Inazo published a book in English titled Bushidō, The Soul of Japan. It was an attempt to explain the moral compass of his country to the outside world. He argued that just as the fragrance of the cherry blossom permeates the spring air, the spirit of the samurai permeated every corner of Japanese thought. The physical arts of the warrior were transformed. Kenjutsu, the brutal, pragmatic art of killing a man with a sword, evolved into kendo, the way of the sword. In the modern kendo dojo, the razor-sharp katana is replaced by the shinai, a bamboo sword. The goal is no longer to draw blood, but to strike the opponent's armor with absolute focus and a unified spirit. The old martial arts became paths of self-perfection. They taught discipline, respect, and the quiet control of the ego. But the most profound echo of the samurai was found in the concept of absolute loyalty. The warrior's devotion to his feudal lord did not disappear. It merely shifted its focus. In the latter half of the 20th century, as Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes of the Second World War, a new kind of warrior emerged. This was the corporate warrior, the salaryman. Dressed in a modern suit instead of silk armor, he carried a briefcase instead of a katana. But the underlying psychology was shockingly similar. He gave his absolute, unquestioning loyalty to his company. He worked grueling, impossible hours, sacrificing his personal desires and family time for the glory and success of the collective group. To be fired or to fail, the company carried a heavy, crushing shame that echoed the disgrace of the ancient Rōnin. Even today, if you walk through the neon-drenched streets of modern Tokyo, beneath the towering glass skyscrapers and the roar of the bullet trains, you can still feel the silent presence of the old warriors. It is there in the polite, deeply respectful bow of a shopkeeper. It is there in the obsessive, quiet perfection of a sushi chef preparing a single piece of fish. It is there in the spotless, organized silence of a morning train. The katana may be sheathed, sitting quietly behind museum glass. But the steel remains sharp in the minds of the people. The samurai are gone, but their shadows still dictate the rhythm of Japan. The history of the samurai is written in blood, steel, and cherry blossoms. But that history now belongs to the past. The battles have ended. The ancient castles are quiet. Now it is time for you to lay down your own sword. Whatever battles you fought today, whatever armor you had to wear, you can take it off now. Imagine yourself lying on a soft tatami mat, deep inside a quiet wooden temple. The sliding paper doors are open just a crack, letting in the cool, damp night air. Outside, a gentle rain is falling on the gravel of the Zen garden. There is nothing left to defend. There is nowhere else you need to be. Breathe in deeply. And as you breathe out, empty your mind. Let your thoughts drift away like leaves on a dark, slow-moving river. From the Dream History team, we hope this journey through the floating world has brought you peace. If it has, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Let us know in the comments where you would like to travel next in the quiet hours of the night. Until then, rest well. And good night.